My name is Irena Swanson, and this is the second part of a three-part series on making rows of 8 squares on point surrounded by triangles. In the first part, I showed how to make such parallelograms, either with one or the other slant, and I made each one of them with only 6 seams total, as opposed to with 23 seams needed with traditional piecing. I also showed in the first episode how to convert these parallelograms into rectangles so they can be incorporated into a quilt, and I showed examples that we can keep the parallelograms as they are, fill in the holes with triangles, and incorporate that into a quilt. In this part, I show how to make 2 rows at the same time. There are several reasons for making 2 rows at the same time, and the first one is that the second row is made with only 3 seams extra. That's really fast. Another reason is that we get more design opportunities. Here I separated the colors into the 2 different rows, but I could have mixed and matched them, maybe alternated in the 2. I can also keep this fabric the same, and this other triangle fabric could be different for other design opportunities, and this changing the triangle colors is not possible when we only make 1 row at a time. And then the last reason I give for making 2 rows at the same time is that we can make longer rows if necessary as well. If you do make 2 of these, I would not put those that came from the same batch together, because there are more efficient ways of making checkerboard patterns without unnecessarily cutting a square into 2 parts. So do watch the first part of this series. Just like in the first part, I cut all strips from selvage to selvage. The strips for the square fabrics are cut 5 inches wide, and the strips for the triangle fabrics are cut between 6 inches and 7 inches, and the first episode tells you how I use the different widths. Once the strips are sewn together, press all seam allowances either all in one direction or all towards the dark fabrics. And then what we want to do is we want to cut this in half lengthwise, and we want to make sure that each half has at least 20 usable inches. So ignore these seam allowances. Here I only have this much usable space. So I typically just fold them together, fold the halves together, and make sure that each part has 20 inches, and then I cut there. Alright, here is the cut. I just cut these apart. And then I want to take these 2 pieces sideways and sew them together after rotating. And when I sew them together, again, I want to make sure that the usable part here is at least 20 inches. So I have to sew here. And then I also have to sew there on both sides. But I like to stop after the first seam so I can press that seam allowance. So here it is. And then for the second seam to form the wide tube, I have to make sure that I introduce no twisting here. All right, so no sideways twisting. So I sew that as well. So say here is that second, the last seam. I glide my iron over this, and then I slip the iron inside and press this seam allowance. Now that all is pressed, I can turn the tube inside out so I can see the beautiful colors, I can see what's happening. So obviously here I'm making 2 colors, and all the triangle fabrics are the same. All right. So now we have to cut this wide tube into narrow tubes. The narrow tubes have to have width exactly 5 inches. And because we had usable strip width 20 inches near the end, we get 4 of these narrow tubes. The narrow tubes have comfortable circumference, so it's easy to sew 2 of these narrow tubes together. And what we want to do is start forming these points here. That's what here we'll be sewing these seams over here we're sewing these seams. So we can either form these diagonals or these diagonals, and we can even alternate colors. So if we want to switch the two shades of squares in rows, if we want to say blue, yellow, then we will form diagonals this way. Whichever way you do it, you want to make sure that the seam allowances at these matches point in opposite directions. In that way we get much more precise points. Right. So here is the wide tube made from the 4 narrow tubes. At this point we could press all seam allowances inside, but I try to avoid pressing on tubes if I can. If the strip width for triangles was 6 3/4 of an inch or wider, then I don't press at this time. I just smooth things out. There's enough leeway here. But if it's narrower, then I will press the tube at least along one of these triangle diagonals down the middle here. In any case, whether this is pressed or not, I may find halfway points between these along these seams inside the triangle diagonals, or maybe I just eyeball them, and then I connect those dots with a pencil, extend that, and then we start cutting. So here I already started cutting. We want to cut this tube all the way across. We will have to make sure we don't cut the back of the tube. So we are creating the post tube. So here is a post tube. I just made that cut, and once I have a cut, we have a parallelogram, and this flat piece is very easy to press, and typically I press the rows all in one direction. So at this point we can see 4 of these narrow parallelograms. Each of the narrow parallelograms has 4 squares on point. So if we just want such parallelograms only half the length, all we do is cut, we're done. But if we want 8 at a time, then what we do now is cut down the middle here. Again, eyeball or measure precisely so you're really down the middle. Here I did the cut, and once we cut, we take one of the 2 halves and move it up here and sew these together, and that is the last seam for making parallelograms as on the wall. Here is an example where the square fabrics are identical. So I made that last seam, pressed it, and now I can cut down the middle, and I get 2 identical parallelograms, one and the other. If in the original strip set, all the fabrics, all the 4 strips were of different color, I would now get something like this. Alright, so in each of the halves we have a row of identical squares, but one edge is yellow, the other edge is lavender, and the other way on the other side. Alright, so this shows how to make 2 parallelograms like this at the same time with only 9 seams total. But what if we wanted to make a long row like this, double the length? Then certainly we can cut this one here into the 2 rows, and then with the 10th seam make that very long row. But rather than 10 seams, we can make that long row with only 8 seams if we just go back to the post tube stage. So in the post tube stage, we cut this in half and then did some maneuvering. But here we do some slitting and actually instructions for how to convert this post tube into one very long parallelogram. The instructions for that are in my video on making bias tape and multi-tape. So the link will be at the bottom. Anyway, I hope that you enjoyed my video on how to make rows of these squares on point even more efficiently, and watch the third part as well for even greater efficiency.